This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. Today's discussion will focus on the lead-up to World War I, the end of the so-called First Age of Globalization, and the role anti-Semitism caused in the unraveling of the German imperial project. The German businessman Albert Ballin, who declared that "my field is the world," stood at the nexus of Germany's role as a technological and financial powerhouse between Bismarck's unification of Germany in 1871 and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in 1914. Ballin was a pacifist, a globalist, a believer in the new German Empire, and a Jew. He was the general director of the Hamburg America Line, the largest shipping company in the world in the early 1900s. He believed he could stave off Germany getting into a war with England and Russia. Sadly, militaristic and expansionist forces conspiring against him proved too strong, and Germany ended up embroiled in a dreaded two-front war. A committed German patriot and pacifist, Albert Ballin felt he was constantly walking a cultural tightrope. Born to a lower-middle-class Jewish family in Hamburg in 1857, he had to drop out of school at 17 after the death of his father. He transformed a middling shipping company into the largest and most profitable shipping company in the world. He spoke English fluently, and although never went to university, was a very cultured man. According to one biographer, apart from music, he was a great lover of literature, especially books on belles-lettres, history, and politics. Thanks to his prodigious memory, he was thus able to accumulate vast stores of knowledge. He was deeply admired by a few in the German nobility, including Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow, who said of him, "There were few people who I liked so well. There were few people for whom I felt such an honest respect." Ballin was very smart, but he had not only a sharp mind, he had a mind full of resources, which is exceptionally rare in Germany. He sought and usually found a path of escape. He was thoroughly practical, but he had, thoroughly the autodidact, a deep understanding for culture. Above all, he had a golden heart, and the number he, absent any expectation of recompense, helped with his advice or with his deeds was great indeed. His error was perhaps a certain tendency to try to do right by everyone. His closest friend was the Hamburg banker Max Warburg, who, like him, was a believer in German-Jewish cultural symbiosis. Warburg's firm, M.M. Warburg & Company, helped arrange financing for Hamburg America's rapid growth. No matter that Jews were barred from the foreign service and from high ranks in the military. What mattered was that after centuries of restrictions, Jews in the new German Empire were full citizens. Jews were disproportionately represented in business, academia, and high culture. The feeling of confidence extended to many Jews of the neighboring Austro-Hungarian Empire, who had been granted full citizenship rights by Emperor Franz Joseph. As Rabbi Adolf Jelinek of Vienna had proudly declared, "The Jews are Germans in Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, Galicia, Moravia, and Silesia. In the other countries in which mixing takes place, the Jews represent the German language, the bearer of culture, education, and science. The freedom of the Jews is at the same time the freedom of German culture." Imperial Germany, although bound by a common language, was not unlike the United States. It was made up of many disparate, culturally distinct territories that had been at odds with each other for hundreds of years. The North was primarily Protestant, the South Catholic. Prussia, the state that had unified the other regions under the Hohenzollern dynasty in 1871, was, with the exception of Berlin, agrarian and militaristic. The Hanseatic port cities such as Hamburg and Bremen were cosmopolitan and had deep trading ties with Great Britain. To survive and thrive in this unified empire, Germany's Jews depended on equal and fair treatment under the law, rather than the whims of individual princes and town councils. Unlike his serenely confident friend Max Warburg, Albert Ballin was keenly aware that the country had two cultural viruses that threatened to capsize its ascent as a global power. The first was a deep-seated anti-Semitism that erupted into violence during times of stress. Martin Luther, the 16th century leader of the German Reformation, declared of Germany's Jews, "Moreover, they are nothing but thieves and robbers who daily eat no morsel and wear no thread of clothing which they have not stolen and pilfered from us by means of their accursed usury. Thus they live from day to day, together with wife and child, by theft and robbery, as arch thieves and robbers, in the most impenitent security." This hatred continued even after Otto von Bismarck unified most of German-speaking Europe under Prussian rule in 1871 and gave the empire's Jewish population full citizenship rights. Jews were forbidden to serve as diplomats or in high government posts. Adolf Stoecker, court preacher to the Hohenzollern royal family, self-appointed defender of the German working class, and member of the Reichstag, declared, "The Jews are and remain a people within a people, a state within a state, a separate tribe within a foreign race. All immigrants are eventually absorbed by the people among whom they live, all save the Jews. They pit their unbroken Semitic character against Teutonic nature, their rigid cult of law, or their hatred of Christians against Christianity. We cannot condemn them for this. As long as they are Jews, they are bound to act in this way. But we must, in all candor, state the necessity of protecting ourselves against the dangers of such an intermingling." As pogroms in Russia increased, more Jews tried to get out from under Tsarist oppression. They amassed at the Prussian-Russian border in large migrant camps. Most wanted to get to the ports of Bremen and Hamburg, and from there board ships bound for America. The German government feared that some would try to settle in the German Empire. Germany, still struggling with the growing pains of unification under Bismarck, was in a poor political position to integrate potentially hundreds of thousands of new arrivals from the Russian Empire. So the German government in Berlin passed a series of edicts to keep that from happening. The Prussian government expelled 30,000 migrant Polish and Jewish seasonal laborers, and also required migrants traveling through the province to carry at least 400 marks in cash per adult, plus 100 marks for each child, to pay for an eventual return journey back to Russia. For most impoverished Jews, this was an unattainable sum. In the 1890s, Albert Ballin, then head of the passenger divisions at the Hamburg-America line, made a deal with the German government. The Hamburg-America line, in cooperation with its rival North German Lloyd, would take over all border control stations. There, they would inspect all would-be immigrants for contagious diseases and fumigate all men, women, and children, and their luggage. Those holding tickets for America would be permitted to pass. They would then be put on sealed trains that would take them to Hamburg or Bremen, where they would board their ships to America. Those seeking to stay in Germany would either be turned back or forced to buy steerage tickets to America from one of the steamship companies. It was a system roundly criticized by German Jewish aid organizations, but it worked for 20 years, while keeping the right-wing nationalists at bay. The other cultural virus in Germany was Prussian militarism. From 1871 to 1914, German ports such as Hamburg and industrial centers such as Dusseldorf generated vast amounts of new wealth, especially in mining and manufacturing. To support this industrial revolution, an ecosystem of banking sprung up to raise capital. Unlike other German states, Prussia, which included much of modern-day Poland, continued to base much of its wealth and power on vast landholdings. Its aristocracy, which had outsized political power in Berlin, were militaristic, provincial, and fearful of banking in Frankfurt, shipping in Hamburg, and industry in the Ruhr. It was the Prussian aristocracy that itched the most for a conflict, especially with Russia, from which they hoped to expand their agrarian landholdings. In spite of these rumblings, a serene confidence continued to pervade the elites of Europe and America. Under the so-called Pax Britannica, in which Great Britain controlled 34% of the globe and ruled over 415 million people, many felt that perhaps the world had reached the end of history. Even though there were cracks forming in the facade of the British Empire, rivalry with ascendant Germany was a big cause of these tensions, there was a smug consensus among the ruling classes of the West that another war was simply unthinkable. The Western world was simply too interconnected through commerce and shared interest to actually go to war. Not to mention that the royal families of Britain, Germany, Spain, Belgium, Russia, Romania, and Austria-Hungary were all intermarried. What could possibly go wrong? In retrospect, many in the upper class claimed to have smelled the rot, as sweet and lovely as everything appeared on the surface. The writer George Orwell was one of them. From the whole decade before 1914, there seemed to breathe forth a smell of the more vulgar, ungrown-up kind of luxury, he wrote many years later. The smell of brilliantine and creme de menthe and soft-scented chocolates, an atmosphere, as it were, of eating everlasting strawberry ices on green lawns to the tune of the Eton boating song. Albert Ballin also smelled the rot, even as he entertained the Kaiser at his home in Hamburg. Although he traveled at the highest levels of society, he always felt like an outsider. He had been born poor and Jewish in the slums of Hamburg, and knew anti-Semitism when he saw it. Even though he was head of the Hamburg-America line, his Jewish ancestry prevented him from being an actual owner. He also knew that the steerage business depended on those who suffered under Russian oppression. As war drew closer, Ballin sensed arrogance, stupidity, laziness, greed, and militarism all around him. The German military establishment was itching for a fight. not just to grab more land from the Russian Empire, but to avenge domestic and imperial slights from Great Britain. Albert Ballin had loved Germany as a country, but underneath the prosperity, the high culture, and cosmopolitan facade, he saw deep problems. The worst part of his job as general director was dealing with the fractious maritime unions of Hamburg, who saw him as a capitalist exploiter. Ballin disliked its ruling class, seeing them as provincial and narrow-minded. He grew nervous whenever he had to visit the capital of Berlin for business. Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, who the Kaiser had named as Chancellor of Germany after Albert Ballin turned down the position in 1909, he refused to convert to Protestantism, routinely snubbed him, as did most of the Foreign Office. Bethmann-Hollweg was a major proponent of the theory of Lebensraum, in which Germany had to fight wars of expansion to survive economically and to grow its population. It was a term invented by the ethnographer Friedrich Ratzel in 1901, who wrote that, without war, inferior or decaying races would easily choke the growth of healthy, budding elements of the Germanic race. In this Germany, there was no room for immigrants, Jews, or cosmopolitans, only militarists and nationalists. It was a pretext for a war of expansion in the East, Russia-controlled Poland, where there was a large population of Jews who, in the early 1900s, were trying to escape from Tsarist persecution. Ratzel left the questions of what to do with them in an expanded German Reich for others to determine. In 2 decades, following Germany's catastrophic defeat in a 2-front war of expansion, Germany would find the person to carry out Ratzel's goal of Lebensraum. This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.